This is not a story of a roaring fire in a blizzard, but of a single candle holding its own against the summer twilight. It is a story for those who know that the most profound declarations are not shouted against the wind, but whispered into the quiet space between two souls learning to trust, proving that the deepest love is found not in grand rescues, but in the steady, gentle mending of a life once lived alone. Silas moved through his cabin with the economy of a man who has measured the same space 1,000 times. The floorboards knew his weight. The latch on the door knew the specific pressure of his thumb. He washed his single plate, his single fork, and set them on the drying rack he had built from river willow. Outside, the sun bled across the horizon, painting the dust motes dancing in the last light slanting through the clean glass of his window. The world was vast and quiet, and he was a still point within it. His days were ordered by the sun and the needs of his small homestead, mending fences, drawing water, tending the stoic, hardy plants in his garden. He did not mind the labor. It was honest, and it filled the hours that might otherwise be overrun by the crushing silence of a home built for more than one. In the evenings, he would light a single lamp and read, the words a poor substitute for a human voice, but a comfort nonetheless. He had made his bed, a sturdy frame, a mattress stuffed with fresh straw, and it was always made for one. The sheets were clean, the blanket folded neatly at the foot. It was a space of order, of solitude, of a loneliness so profound and familiar, it had become a part of the cabin's very scent, like pine and wood smoke. He set his book aside, the silence pressing in. It was in these moments, between the turning of a page and the drawing of a breath, that the ache for another presence was sharpest. A shared look across a table, the soft sound of another's breathing in the dark. It was a foolish yearning, he knew. He was a quiet man, his history carved into the lines around his eyes, and he had long accepted his lot. He blew out the lamp, the room plunging into the soft, gray dark of early night. Just as his eyes adjusted to the moonlight, painting a silver square upon the floor, a sound broke the stillness. A soft, hesitant knocking at his door. No one ever came to his cabin, especially not after sundown. His hand went instinctively to the hilt of the knife at his belt, not in aggression, but in readiness. He moved without a sound, his feet sure on the warm wood. He lifted the latch, pulling the door inward just enough to see a figure cloaked in shadow, a woman holding a worn carpet bag. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes wide with a mixture of weariness and apprehension. The woman on his doorstep looked as though the world had scoured her, clean of everything but a fierce, bone-deep dignity. He could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, but her chin was high. She held a piece of paper in her hand, now slightly crumpled. "I am looking for the cabin of a Mr. Croft," she said, her voice softer than he'd expected, yet clear. The land agent in town said it was the last one on this path. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew Croft, a man whose smiles never reached his eyes, who bought up land and loyalty with the same casual, possessive air. "Croft's place is another mile east," Silas said, his own voice rough from disuse. "The path forks. It's easy to miss the turn." He saw the flicker of dismay in her eyes, the slight slump of her posture. Another mile, in the dark, on a path she did not know. His own moral code was as simple and unyielding as the granite hills behind his home. You did not turn away someone in need, especially not a woman alone, to send her on to a man like Croft in the dead of night. "You are Eleanora Finch?" he asked, though he knew the answer. Croft had been boasting in town for a week about the widow he had hired as a housekeeper, his tone proprietary and unpleasant. She nodded, a flicker of surprise on her face. "You can't go on tonight," he stated. It was not a suggestion. "The path is treacherous. You can stay here. I'll see you to his property in the morning." Her eyes narrowed slightly, searching his face, assessing the threat. He understood. He was a stranger, a large man standing in a dark doorway. He stepped back, opening the door wider to the small, clean space behind him, the hearth with its banked embers. It was the only invitation he could offer. "You would be safe here," he added, the words feeling clumsy but necessary. She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze sweeping the room, taking in the single chair, the neatly made bed, the utter lack of another's presence. She seemed to find something there that eased her fear. She gave a small, tired nod. "For the night, thank you." She stepped over the threshold, and the silence of the cabin changed. It was no longer empty. As she stood there, uncertain, her worn bag held tight in her hands, a strange and powerful feeling rose in him, something akin to a prayer finding its answer in the most unexpected way. The words left his mouth before he could stop them, low and raw with an honesty that startled them both. "I've been praying for you." Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. A dark flush rose on his neck. He hadn't meant it like that, not as some pious pronouncement. He had meant that the crushing loneliness, the silent ache for another soul to share his space, had been a constant, unspoken plea to the universe. And here she was. "I mean," he stammered, clearing his throat, "I mean, it is good to have a guest. Welcome." He turned away, busying himself with stirring the embers in the hearth, his movements stiff with embarrassment. He had said too much, revealed a part of his solitary heart that he kept locked away. He felt her watching him, the weight of her gaze a palpable thing in the small, quiet room. Eleanora watched the back of the man Silas, he'd called himself, as he knelt by the hearth. The words he'd spoken still hung in the air, strange and unsettlingly intimate. "I've been praying for you." It wasn't the greeting a woman alone on a frontier expected. She had been prepared for suspicion, for gruffness, perhaps even for propositions. But not for that. Not for a confession that sounded like it had been pulled from a deep, hidden well of loneliness. Her late husband, a man of loud pronouncements and shallow feeling, would never have uttered such a thing. She clutched her bag, her only worldly possessions contained within, and took another careful survey of the room. It was painfully neat, the mark of a man long accustomed to solitude. There were no feminine touches, but there was care. The floor was swept, a single cup on the shelf was clean. A mended patch on the curtain was sewn with thick, clumsy stitches. Her gaze fell on his bed, and a familiar tension coiled in her stomach. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice firm. She would not put a man out of his own bed. It was a line she had drawn for herself long ago. She would accept help, but not at the cost of her own or another's dignity. He turned from the now glowing embers, his face illuminated by the soft, warm light. It was a stoic face, all sharp angles and quiet gravity, but his eyes held no guile. "There is a cot," he said, gesturing to a corner she hadn't noticed. "It will do for me? The bed is yours." "No," she said, the word sharper than she intended. "I will not. The cot is fine for me." A silent negotiation passed between them. He seemed to understand that this was not a matter of comfort, but of principle. After a moment, he gave a slow nod. "As you wish." He set about preparing the small cot, pulling a clean-looking blanket from a chest at the foot of his bed. He worked with a quiet competence that she found herself grudgingly admiring. He did not hover or fuss. He gave her space. The next morning, the smell of coffee woke her. He was already up, moving about the cabin with that same noiseless purpose. He had set a cup and a piece of hardtack on the small table for her. She sat up, her back aching from the cot, and pushed the stray hairs from her face. She would not be a guest. She would not be a burden. When he came back inside from the woodpile, she was standing, her bag packed. "I thank you for your shelter, Mar," she trailed off, realizing she didn't know his surname. "Silas is enough," he said, his gaze steady. "And you will not be going to Crofts today." It was a statement, not a question. "That is not for you to decide," she replied, her pride rising like a shield. "Croft is not an honorable man," Silas said, his voice low and even. "The way he spoke of you in town, you would not be safe there. Not your person, perhaps, but your dignity. He thinks he has purchased you along with your labor." His words struck a cold chord of truth. She had seen the type before. But what choice did she have? "I have an agreement," she said weakly, "and I have nowhere else to go." "You can stay here," he said. The offer hung in the air, simple and immense. "I will not be a charity case, Silas," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I will earn my keep." He considered her for a long moment. Fair enough. He gestured to a worn chambray shirt hanging from a peg, a long tear under the arm. "I am a poor hand at mending." It was a test, a first step. She took the shirt from him, the worn fabric soft under her fingertips. She ran her thumb over the clumsy, thick stitches he had attempted on the curtain. She looked from the shirt to his steady, waiting eyes. "I will need a needle and thread," she said. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth before vanishing. It was the first crack in his stoic facade, and it felt like a promise. The days settled into a rhythm that was new to Silas, a quiet duet where before there had been only a solo. The sound of Eleanora's needle moving through fabric became as familiar as the call of the morning dove. She was a woman of immense pride and quiet strength, and she held herself to her word. She did not just mend his shirt. She took inventory of his entire sparse existence and began to put it to rights with a gentle but firm hand. She insisted on organizing his pantry, her small hands arranging the tins and sacks of flour into a sensible order that had always eluded him. He would watch her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. She moved with a grace born of resilience, never wasting emotion. He found himself learning the language of her presence. A small sigh meant she was weary. The slight tightening of her lips meant a thought was troubling her. A hum, so low it was almost part of the cabin's silence, meant she was content. One afternoon he sat at the table, sharpening his knife, while she worked on darning a pair of his socks. The silence was comfortable, filled not with emptiness, but with shared purpose. "You do good work," he said, the words feeling inadequate to express the gratitude he felt, not just for the mending, but for her being there at all. She looked up, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. It transformed her face, softening the guarded lines around her eyes. "My mother taught me. She said a good stitch could hold the world together." He thought about that, about the careful, strong stitches she was putting into his sock, into the fabric of his life. He was not a man given to whimsy, but the thought was a powerful one. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, built it strong to keep the world out. Yet here she was, inside its walls, holding it together with a needle and thread. When he had to ride into town for supplies, he felt a strange reluctance to leave. The 10-mile ride, once a welcome break from the monotony, now felt like an exile. In the general store, he bought the usual: flour, salt, beans, and coffee. But then his eyes landed on a display of sewing notions. Spools of thread in various colors, fine needles in a paper packet, a small silver thimble. He thought of her, her fingers sometimes pricked and sore from pushing the dull needle he owned through thick canvas. Without allowing himself to second-guess the impulse, he bought a packet of the finest needles, a spool of dark blue thread that matched his shirts, and the thimble. He did not consider it a gift. It was a tool for the work she was doing, a practical thing. Yet as he rode home, the small packet felt heavy with a meaning he couldn't quite name. He found her outside, tending to the small herb garden he had neglected. She looked up as he approached, shielding her eyes from the sun. He dismounted, and feeling uncharacteristically awkward, simply held the small parcel out to her. She wiped her hands on her apron and took it, her expression curious. She opened the paper, and her breath caught. She looked at the needles, the thread, the thimble shining in her palm. Then she looked up at him, her eyes searching his. He had expected simple thanks. He had not expected to see a sheen of moisture in her eyes, a look of such profound, startled gratitude that it made his own throat tighten. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered. It was more than a thank you for the tools. It was an acknowledgment of being seen, of her small, unspoken needs being met. It was a stitch, holding them just a little bit closer. The rain began in the late afternoon, a soft drumming on the roof that slowly grew into a relentless downpour. It was a summer storm, warm but fierce, and it turned the world outside the cabin into a blur of green and gray. Eleanora had always found a certain comfort in rain, in the feeling of being enclosed and safe while the world was washed clean. But as the evening wore on, a persistent drip, drip, drip started near the corner where her cot was placed. At first she ignored it, shifting the cot a few inches away. But soon another drip began, and then another. A dark spreading stain appeared on the ceiling planks. Silas, who had been reading by the fire, noticed it at the same time. He set his book down and stood, his expression grim, as he watched the water seep through the roof he had so carefully built. "I thought I'd sealed that section last spring," he said, his voice tight with frustration. He placed a bucket under the worst of the leaks, but the cot was now in a damp, miserable corner, the floor around it slick with water. She could see the tension in his shoulders. This cabin was his pride, his fortress, and it had been breached. She tried to make light of it, wringing out the corner of her blanket. A little water never hurt anyone. But as night fell and the rain continued unabated, the damp chill began to seep into her bones. She would not complain, but she shivered as she sat at the table, trying to read by the lamplight. Silas watched her, his brow furrowed. He got up and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. The space between them felt charged, the sound of the rain and the dripping buckets amplifying the silence. Finally he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, as if he had weighed every word. "You cannot sleep there. It's too damp. You will catch a chill." She looked at her cot, then at his large, dry bed against the far wall. There was no other option. A flush of heat crept up her neck, a mixture of apprehension and something else, something she was afraid to name. "Silas, you will take the bed," he said, cutting off her protest. "I will take the floor by the hearth. It is the warmest place in the house anyway." He was offering her not just his comfort, but his honor. He was placing her well-being above his own, and in doing so, he was giving her all the power. Still, she hesitated. To sleep in his bed, the most intimate space in his solitary life, felt like a boundary crossed. He seemed to read her thoughts, his gaze steady and clear. "Nora," he said, the first time he had used the shortened version of her name. It sounded impossibly gentle in his rough voice. "It is just for warmth, for comfort, nothing more. I give you my word." He paused, then added the 3 words that sealed the trust between them. "Only if you want." Her breath hitched. Only if you want. The choice was entirely hers. Her past was littered with men who had assumed and taken and demanded. This man, this quiet, honorable stranger, was asking. He was offering safety and expecting nothing in return. She looked from his earnest, open face to the warm, dry sanctuary of his bed. The trust he was showing her was a greater comfort than any blanket. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes," she whispered. The word was a key, unlocking a new room in the small house of their shared existence. "Thank you, Silas." He simply nodded, his relief palpable, and turned to lay his own blankets on the floor by the fire, his back to her, granting her the privacy to make the bed her own for the night. A week after the storm, a shadow fell across the sunlit doorway. Eleanora was kneading bread dough, her hands dusted with flour, when she looked up to see a man standing there. He was well dressed in a town coat and polished boots that seemed out of place in the rustic setting. He smiled, but it was a thin, proprietary expression that did not warm his pale eyes. "Mrs. Finch, I presume," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "I am Alistair Croft. I believe you are expecting to take up a position in my household." Eleanora's hands stilled in the dough. So this was the man Silas had warned her about. He had an air of ownership about him, as if her presence on this property was a clerical error he had come to correct. Before she could form a reply, Silas stepped into the cabin from the woodshed, his arms laden with split logs. He stopped short when he saw the visitor, and the easy peace of the morning vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp tension. He set the wood down by the hearth, his movements deliberate, placing himself squarely between her and Mr. Croft. He did not speak, but his presence was a statement, a solid, immovable wall. Croft's gaze flickered to Silas, a dismissive sneer touching his lips. "And you are the hired help?" "I own this land," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. Croft's eyebrows raised in feigned surprise. "Indeed? Well, there has been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Finch was contracted to me. She seems to have lost her way." He addressed his next words to Eleanora, his tone indulgent, as if speaking to a wayward child. "No matter. I've come to collect you. Pack your things. My home is far more suitable for a woman of your delicate nature." The condescension in his voice was like a spark to dry tinder. Eleanora wiped her floured hands on her apron, her back straightening. She had spent too long being treated as property, as a delicate nature to be managed. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am not lost. I have chosen to stay here." Croft's smile faltered. He looked from her determined face to Silas's stony expression. "Stay here? In this hovel? With him? Madam, have you taken leave of your senses? I am offering you a respectable position. A roof over your head, proper wages." "I have a roof over my head," she retorted, gesturing to the solid beams above. "And I earn my keep." "Is that what he calls it?" Croft's voice dripped with insinuation. He took a step forward, his gaze raking over Silas with contempt. "Listen to me, Finch. A widow's reputation is a fragile thing. Living here, unchaperoned, people will talk. I am offering you protection." "I am already protected," she said, her eyes meeting Silas's for a brief, steadying moment. Silas still had not moved, his silence more powerful than any threat. He was letting her fight her own battle, but making it clear he was her second if she needed one. His respect for her agency was a shield far stronger than any Croft could offer. Croft's face hardened, the veneer of civility cracking. "You will regret this decision. A woman alone is vulnerable. You need a man of standing to look after you." "I am not alone," Eleanora said, her voice ringing with a finality that left no room for argument. Croft stared at her for a long, silent moment, his ambition warring with his disbelief. Finally, he turned on his heel with a frustrated scoff and stalked away, the sunlight seeming to brighten in his absence. The tension in the cabin slowly dissipated, leaving a quiet hum in its wake. Silas finally turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right?" She let out a shaky breath. She hadn't realized she was holding and nodded. "I am." She looked at him, at the man who had stood as a silent guardian, who had trusted her to speak for herself. In that moment, the cabin did not feel like a hovel. It felt like a fortress. And it felt like home. That evening, the memory of Croft's visit lingered in the air like a foul scent. The confrontation had solidified something between them, an unspoken alliance that now demanded words. They ate their meal in a deeper silence than usual, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. When the plates were cleared, Silas did not pick up his book. He sat across the small table from her, his hands resting on the warm wood. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of things unsaid. It was Eleanora who broke it. "My husband," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "He was a man like Croft. He saw me as an ornament for his home, a testament to his success. He never asked what I wanted. He simply assumed he knew what was best." She looked down at her hands, at the faint scars from years of domestic work that her husband had found unseemly. "When he died, he left me with nothing but his debts. I took the position with Croft because I had no other choice. Safety, he called it. But I've learned that some kinds of safety are just cages with prettier bars." Silas listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. His attention was a physical thing, a warm, steadying presence that gave her the courage to continue. When she finished, the silence returned, but it was different now, filled with the weight of her truth. Then he spoke, his own voice low, sharing a piece of himself in return. "My father was a hard man," he said. "He believed strength was about how much you could take from the world, how loud you could shout. He broke my mother's spirit with his hardness. I swore I would never be like him." He looked around the small, quiet cabin. "I came out here to be alone. I thought it was better than being the man he was. For a long time, the quiet was enough, but it was an empty quiet." He finally met her eyes, and the vulnerability she saw there mirrored her own. "Your being here, the quiet is different now. It's full." He said her name then, softly, as if it were a rare and precious thing. Nora. Just her name, but it held a world of meaning. It was an acknowledgement, a confession, a question. The space between them at the table seemed to shrink, the air growing warm and thick with a yearning that had been building since the night she arrived on his doorstep. The barriers they had so carefully constructed around their wounded hearts were dissolving in the gentle lamplight. She saw him not just as a protector, but as a man who had been as lonely as she was. He saw her not as a survivor to be pitied, but as a resilient soul who had fought for her own dignity. They were two solitary people who had, by a twist of fate, found in the other a reflection of their own deep-seated need for a connection built on respect, not possession. The simple act of sharing their stories had become an intimacy more profound than any touch. The threat of Croft's return, of the town gossip he would surely incite, settled over the cabin in the following days. The arrangement that had begun as a temporary shelter now felt precarious. Silas knew that Eleanora's reputation, as Croft had so cruelly pointed out, was a fragile commodity. He could not, in good conscience, keep her here under these circumstances without offering her a more permanent, more honorable solution. But the thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its hollow silence, was a physical ache in his chest. He spent 2 days wrestling with his thoughts, his words, trying to find a way to offer her a choice that was truly free, unburdened by obligation or necessity. He found her by the creek, washing clothes, the late afternoon sun turning the water to gold. She looked up as he approached, a question in her eyes. He had been quiet and distant for 2 days, and she had noticed. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, feeling as nervous as a boy. "Nora," he began, his voice rough, "Croft will not let this go. He will spread rumors in town. He will make it difficult for you." She stopped her washing, her hands still in the water, and waited. "I can take you to the next town," he offered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You could find work there, start fresh where no one knows you. I have some money saved. It would be yours." He was offering her an escape, a way out of the trouble he felt he had inadvertently brought upon her. It was the honorable thing to do. Her expression was unreadable. "Is that what you want, Silas?" she asked, her voice quiet. The question pierced through his carefully constructed honor. The truth, raw and simple, was all he had left. "No," he said, the word torn from him. "It is the last thing I want." He took a breath, summoning all his courage. "What I want is to ask you to stay, not as a housekeeper, and not as a guest, but as the mistress of this home, as my partner." The words felt huge, momentous. He rushed to clarify, to ensure she understood the nature of his offer. It would be a marriage of convenience, in name only, to protect you from Croft and the gossip. Nothing would have to change between us, unless you wished it to. He looked at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. But the choice must be yours, entirely yours. He had laid his heart bare. He was offering her his name, his home, his protection, all while promising to honor her autonomy. Eleanora looked at him, at this quiet, stoic man who had shown her more kindness and respect in a few weeks than she had known in her entire life. He was offering her a cage with an open door, promising she would always hold the key. But it wasn't a cage. It was a sanctuary. It was a home. "I am not afraid of town gossip," she said softly, "and I do not need a marriage of convenience to protect me." She saw the hope in his eyes falter, the disappointment settle on his features. She reached out, her wet hand closing over his, stopping him before he could turn away. "Silas," she said, her gaze holding his, "I will not stay as your partner in name only." A slow dawn of understanding broke across his face. She was not accepting his practical arrangement. She was asking for something more, something real. "I will stay," she said, her voice clear and sure, "if you will have me as your wife." The trip to town was a public declaration. They rode together on the wagon seat, a respectable distance between them, but the air was charged with a new shared purpose. Eleanora wore her best dress, a simple gray muslin she had mended herself, and Silas wore the blue shirt she had so carefully repaired. As they moved down the town's dusty main street, she could feel the eyes upon them. Windows twitched with curious onlookers. Men on the boardwalk stopped their conversations to stare. The whispers followed them like a swarm of bees. She held her head high, her hands clasped in her lap, but she felt a tremor of apprehension. This public scrutiny was precisely what Croft had threatened. Silas seemed to feel her unease. As he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the general store, he did not immediately get down. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but for the fierce protectiveness in his eyes. He said nothing, but he held out his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was an offer of solidarity. It was a silent vow. We face this together. She placed her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, engulfing hers in a feeling of profound safety. He squeezed her fingers gently before letting go to tether the horse. Just as they were about to step onto the boardwalk, Alistair Croft emerged from the store. He stopped short, a look of pure, venomous fury contorting his features when he saw them together. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "The lost lamb and her. Shepherd, I warned you, Mrs. Finch. Your reputation is now in tatters. No decent person in this town will have anything to do with you." Eleanora flinched, the public shaming as sharp as a slap. But before she could respond, Silas stepped slightly in front of her, not to hide her, but to shield her from the worst of the venom. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood there, a quiet mountain of a man, and looked Croft in the eye. "Mrs. Finch has agreed to become my wife," Silas stated, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the sudden silence of the street. "You will address her as such, and you will not speak to her again." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Croft was momentarily stunned into silence. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to Eleanora's. He had expected her to be ashamed, to be cowed. Instead, she stepped out from behind Silas to stand at his side. She was not looking at Croft. She was looking at Silas, her expression full of a quiet, fierce pride. In a deliberate, final act of choosing, she reached out and took Silas's arm. It was a gesture of ownership, of partnership, of belonging. It told the entire town and Croft everything they needed to know. Silas looked down at her small hand on his forearm and then covered it with his own. The two of them, standing together, were a united front, their silent bond more powerful than all of Croft's blustering words. Defeated and humiliated by their quiet strength, Croft flushed a deep, mottled red, spun on his heel, and stormed away. The whispers that followed them now were different, no longer of scandal, but of awe. As Silas led her into the store, his hand still covering hers, Eleanora knew they had not just won a confrontation. They had laid the foundation of their future, right there on the dusty main street, for all the world to see. The ride back to the cabin was quiet. The emotional tumult of the confrontation in town had left them both drained, but a new, deeper peace had settled between them. The choice had been made, the declaration public. Now there was only the aftermath. As they neared the homestead, Silas pulled a splinter from a hastily loaded crate of supplies, wincing as it drove deeper into the fleshy part of his thumb. He tried to hide the small injury, a lifetime of stoicism making him dismiss his own pain, but Eleanora saw the slight flinch, the way he favored the hand as he unhitched the horse. Inside the cabin, as he began to unload their provisions, she approached him quietly. "Let me see," she said, her voice soft but insistent. He stopped, looking down at his hand, as if just now noticing it. He held it out to her, and she took it gently, turning it over in the light from the window. The splinter was deep, a dark line under the skin. "Sit," she commanded softly. He obeyed without question, taking a seat at the table while she fetched her sewing kit. She pulled out one of the fine, sharp needles he had bought for her, sterilizing the tip in the flame of the lamp. His hand, which could fell a tree or soothe a nervous horse, lay completely still in hers. She could feel the steady, strong pulse at his wrist. Her touch was delicate, her concentration absolute as she carefully worked at the splinter. He did not so much as hiss. He just watched her, his gaze tracing the line of her bowed head, the gentle curve of her neck. The world shrank to this single, intimate act of care. The small, sharp pain of the needle was nothing compared to the overwhelming tenderness that flooded him. This was what had been missing from his life. Not just a presence, but a partner. Someone to notice a small hurt, someone whose touch was a healing balm. With a final, precise movement, she extracted the splinter and held it up for him to see before wiping a single drop of blood from his thumb with a clean cloth. "There," she said, her work done. He looked from the tiny splinter to her face, his eyes full of an emotion so profound he could not have given it a name. He simply lifted her hand, the one that had just tended to him, and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was a gesture of pure, unvarnished devotion. A thank you, a promise, a vow all in one. Later, they shared a simple meal of bread and cheese, the silence in the cabin no longer a void, but a shared sanctuary. The social storm had passed, leaving in its wake the calm, steady truth of their bond. He had protected her in town, and she, in turn, had tended to his wound here at home. It was a perfect, unspoken symmetry, a partnership in all the ways that mattered. In the days following their public stand, a profound shift occurred in the cabin's atmosphere. The practical arrangement had blossomed into a declared partnership, and now, in the quiet moments, it was deepening into something achingly tender. The question of their future, once an unspoken uncertainty, was now a shared landscape waiting to be explored. Silas found himself watching Eleanora constantly, memorizing the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the quiet smile that touched her lips when she read. He had begun a project in the evenings, something he worked on when she was occupied elsewhere. He was not a man of fancy words or grand gestures. His hands were his most honest form of expression. One evening, as she sat mending the sleeve of her own dress by the firelight, he came to her and placed a small object in her palm. It was a bird, carved from a piece of pale, smooth pine. Its lines were simple but perfect, its head tilted as if in mid-song. He had sanded it until it felt like a warm, polished stone in her hand. "For you," he said, his voice a low rumble. She closed her fingers around the small carving, its warmth seeping into her skin. It was more precious than any jewel. It was hours of his time, his patience, his thought. It was a promise of beauty in their simple life, a symbol of the song that had returned to her own heart. "Silas, it's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him and saw her own feelings reflected in his earnest gaze. She set the bird carefully on the mantelpiece, where it seemed to fill the room with its silent music. Then she picked up the blue shirt she had first mended for him. Over the past week, she had been adding a small, secret touch of her own. On the inside of the cuff, where no one else would ever see it, she had embroidered 2 letters, an S and an E, intertwined with a single sturdy thread. She held it out to him. "And this is for you." He took the shirt, his rough thumb tracing the delicate stitches. It was a mark of possession, but not of ownership. It was a claim, a joining of their lives, stitched into the fabric of their everyday. He understood the symbolism immediately. He had given her a token of the future. She had given him a mark of their shared present. "This is your home now, Nora," he said, his voice thick, "if you still want it." She stepped closer, into the circle of warmth cast by the fire and the lamplight, and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, heavy beat beneath her palm. "There is nowhere else I want to be," she vowed. It was not a promise made before a preacher or a crowd, but a quiet truth exchanged between 2 people in the sanctuary they had built together. It was the only vow that mattered. The house was no longer silent. It breathed with the rhythm of 2 lives intertwined. Silas woke not to the stark quiet of solitude, but to the soft sound of Eleanora's breathing from her cot across the room, a promise he had made to her and himself that he would not rush the final boundary between them. The space was still there, but it was no longer a gulf of loneliness. It was a bridge of respect, waiting to be crossed when they were both ready. Their days took on a new shared routine. In the mornings, they moved around each other in the small space with an easy, practiced grace, preparing breakfast, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same utensil. He would go out to work the land, but his work now had a different purpose. He wasn't just surviving. He was building. He was planning. He cleared a new plot of land near the cabin, not for himself, but for the vegetable garden Eleanora wanted to plant come spring. He worked with a renewed vigor, the thought of their future fueling him more than any meal could. She, in turn, transformed the cabin's interior from a sparse shelter into a warm, breathing home. She put up new curtains made from bleached flour sacks, stitched with a simple, cheerful blue thread. She placed the carved bird on the windowsill, where it caught the morning light. She even convinced Silas to build a small bookshelf, and their 2 meager collections of books now sat side by side, their stories mingling. One evening they sat on the small porch he had built, watching the sunset. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between 2 people who have no need for words to understand one another. He had been thinking about the name on the deed to his land, the papers locked away in his strongbox. Silas Black, a solitary name. He turned to her, his heart full. "I need to ride to the county seat next week," he said, "to file some papers at the courthouse." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "I need to add a name to the deed," he clarified, his voice quiet but sure. "Eleanora Black." Her breath caught in her throat. It was the final, indelible stitch, binding her to this land, to this home, to him. It was a promise of permanence, of a shared future, written not just in thread, but in ink. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. His fingers laced through hers, a familiar, perfect fit. The last of the sun's light faded, and the first stars began to appear in the vast velvet sky. The cabin behind them was dark, but a single lamp glowed warmly in the window, a beacon in the quiet frontier. It was no longer just his home. It was theirs, and it was enough.